Okay, we're going to be taking a dive into the Haggadah tonight. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the sages, the protagonists of the Haggadah. Let's start with Maisa Rabbi Eliezer, a story with the following sages. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. Shahayu Mesubin Bivnei Brak, they were gathered in the city of Bnei Brak, which is currently even worse than New York right now for the coronavirus. Vahayu Misaprin B'Yitzias Mitzrayim Kol Osa Halayla. They were talking about the story of the Exodus from Egypt that entire evening. Ad Shubo Talmidehem, until their students, the disciples came, V'amru Lehem, and told them, Rabosenu Higiyas Man Kriya Shema Shel Shachris. Our teachers, the time for the morning Shema has arrived. I want to share with you the backstory of these people, and we'll also use other paragraphs of the Haggadah as well to talk about who they were, what their backgrounds were, who their wives in some cases may have been, their problems, their challenges, the inner political world they face, not just from external enemies such as Rome and other factions of Jews who did not share their beliefs or practices, but also from within the walls of the yeshiva, within the walls of the academy, politics that sometimes had almost catastrophic consequences, as well as what happened from that generation. I draw a lot of inspiration, not just because I study their teachings today and every day, but also because of who they were and the lives that they lived. And I think if you will bear with me tonight, I will be able to show you, I don't usually like to say things, I will be able to show you how the very difficulties that these people went through made them have a quality of Torah that's so true that it influences us until today. And it didn't come because they had it easy. It came because they gave themselves totally over to what Torah is. And because of that, we have the Mishnah and the Medrash and the Talmud and the Halacha and Hasidus and Musar and Kabbalah, all were inspired by these men and their wives also, that we are going to learn about as well to some degree. Okay, who are these people? Who is Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua? We'll start with them. They're the senior rabbis here. Rabbi Eliezer is also known as Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, or the Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Hyrcanus. He was somebody who started learning late in life, and he married the royalty, the sister of Rabbi Gamliel, who is not mentioned in this paragraph. His absence is felt. We'll talk about him later. He was the Nasi, was Rabbi Gamliel II. He was the exilarch. He was the chief of the academy, the leader of the Jewish people, so to speak. That not Rabbi Eliezer, his brother-in-law. Okay, let's talk about the time that Rabbi Eliezer lived. He was one of the two students, along with Rabbi Yehoshua, who, when their teacher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, wanted to make appeasement with Rome during the sack and destruction of Jerusalem, during the period of the destruction of the temple, when hundreds of thousands of Jewish people were killed maybe more, maybe millions. Arguably the greatest destruction with the possible exception of the Holocaust. But in some sense, the greatest destruction because essentially because of that destruction, we're exiled until today. So while the Holocaust may be numerically greater, the blow to the Jewish people cannot be underestimated. And yet, at that very moment, 3 rabbis hatched a plan. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, tell everyone I'm sick and that I'm dying, and then announce that I'm dead and say, you're going to bury me outside of, they didn't bury people in Jerusalem within the walled city. And there's whole stories of how they even let his body get out without it being stabbed by the Beryonim, by those who were fighting at all costs, even if it meant suicide against Rome. His 2 students, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, that we mentioned first in the story in the Haggadah, carried his coffin out, and once they got out of sight, he came back to life. He wasn't really dead. And they met with Vespasian, who was the general who would later become the ruler of Rome. He asked for, the main thing he asked for is to give him Yavna and its sages, to allow the academy to continue, for the rabbinic world to not be taken down with the destruction of Rome. And that was granted to him. So that is those 2 people were part of that. They were not their teacher, but they were his students. They were the ones who literally took him out and allowed him, their teacher, to continue the Jewish way of life through the rabbis and the teachers, despite the impending total destruction of Jerusalem and death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews. So that's, again, who are these people? These are the people, these are the rabbis, at least the older ones, like these 2, who were alive and witnessed the destruction of the temple, who were alive and witnessed the fall of Jerusalem, who were alive and witnessed their brothers and sisters being killed, who were alive and witnessed their brothers and sisters being sent into slavery. Now the question becomes, when you are a survivor from that devastation, what do you do? When your main way of serving God was associated with the Beit HaMikdash, what do you do? Okay, so that's a good question, and that question is even more pertinent to the Pesach Seder, because everybody knows from a biblical perspective, there's a lot of emphasis put on the Pesach offering, and everybody would be Ola Regel. It would be a beautiful sight to see. People streaming into Jerusalem the day or 2 before Passover, and then having lambs and bringing them per their families, and then after the ritual slaughter of the lambs, and there was a lot of fanfare in that, they would go and take the lambs and roast them, and that was an essential part. It was a sacred part of each family or micro community Seder, that the matzah and the maror and anything else was supplemental, essentially, to the Pesach, the korban, the offering. And now you don't have that, but what do you have? So you have this story. And what's the story? The story is they didn't have the Pesach offering, but they could talk. The story is about a story being told. The story is about these rabbis who sat around telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. They no longer they had the matzah, they had the mar, they no longer had the Beit HaMikdash, they no longer had Jerusalem, they no longer had the korban Pesach, but they had one another. Just to kind of create a reference point, I know a lot of people are saying, we don't even have that, we're going to be alone. No, it's actually not a fair comparison. That's true, because they were missing the people who were killed in their Holocaust of their time. They were missing the avoda of the Beit Hamikdash because that no longer existed. They were missing the very essence of what they considered the Pesach night, the Seder, the Korban Pesach. So they were actually missing much, 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 much more. And because of what they were missing, that's why they created the Seder the way we know it today. It's precisely because they didn't have everything that they came up with something that is so special and so sacred that we're holding on to today. So that's the premise of this whole shir. It's not a new premise. A lot of people have said, wow, these people really had to reimagine what to do without Korban Pesach. Some people might have thrown in the towel. It's not a new premise, but I want to show you more about their lives. My premise is to feel if that premise holds any water in terms of not just the time period in history they lived in, but the actual lives they lived and the things they went through. So that's the first two of the rabbis in that story, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. The third is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And the fourth is Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is a very important figure. And I want to tell you a little bit about the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. In order to do that, I want to first tell you about the person who replaced Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That was Rabbi Gamliel II. There was a series of people. There was Hillel and Shimon, there was Gamliel, and then Shimon ben Gamliel, and then there's Rabbi Gamliel. Something, hopefully I'm getting it correctly. It's the dynasty of Hillel. Hillel was a sage who lived during the Second Temple period. He did not witness the destruction of the temple. He died before that time. And he left a dynasty, and the dynasty consisted of his son, grandson, great-grandson, who I believe Gamliel was the fourth generation from Hillel. So it was a dynasty. The only problem is with dynasty is that Gamliel had a certain cavalier attitude towards some of his contemporaries. Most notably, he would often not only argue with Rabbi Yehoshua, who is in this. He was the second sage mentioned here. Rabbi Elazar, the first sage, had an argument with the academy, and it wasn't just Gamliel. It was the vast majority of the academy did not agree with the laws of ritual purity around a certain type of I don't want to say portable oven, but an oven that had a certain portable element to it called the Tanur Shel Achnai. And that's a famous story where Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus says, if the law is like me, let the river go backwards. All these miracles started happening, and even a baskel, even a heavenly voice went out to say, the law follows Rabbi Elazar. And yet the rabbis did not listen to the heavenly voice. Not only did they not listen, they excommunicated Rabbi Elazar. This is not Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, this is Rabbi Elazar Hagadol. They excommunicated him, and there's a tragic element to the end period of his life when he never fully got integrated. And later on, before his death, Rabbi Akiva went to visit him and try to console him, but it would never be the same for him. But in that incident, Rabbi Gamliel was with the other sages. There was an understanding that Rabbi Elazar Hagadol was one individual, plus he might have had God on his side, but that didn't matter. We have the famous dictum that came out of that argument, Torah lo b'shamayim hi. We don't listen to heaven when there's an argument below. We follow the ruling of the majority of the rabbis, and they decided against him. So that's okay. That was done. That was not the fault of Rabbi Gamliel per se. However, when it came to Rabbi Yoshua, that was a different matter. Rabbi Yoshua was a great sage. He was a greater sage than Rabbi Gamliel, and in three instances, Rabbi Gamliel really disrespected him. What are we talking about? What are those three instances? So one is a famous story where they had a dispute about the calendar, when the month of Tishrei would fall out on. And Rabbi Gamliel had a different date than Rabbi Yeshua when it came to Yom Kippur, yet Rabbi Gamliel, knowing that, specifically demanded that Rabbi Yeshua appear before him with his walking stick and his money purse, and so on and so forth, to show in public that Rabbi Yeshua was wrong, and Rabbi Yeshua not only was wrong, he would have to bend his will and accept that day as not Yom Kippur, which Rabbi Yeshua did. And there were two other stories. One seemed to have to do with something simple, which was there was a dispute amongst the sages. The one side was Rabbi Yoshua, who said the davening ma'ariv, the evening prayer, is rishus. It's optional. And Rabbi Gamliel says it's a chova, it's obligatory. Now, Rabbi Gamliel didn't like any open dissent about that. He refused to listen to the other opinion. But there was a rabbi, and it's kept a secret in the Talmud until a later point when it's revealed at the right moment. And this is all taken from a Talmud on the 27b and 28a in Brachot, if you're interested in looking it up. And this rabbi, he wasn't even a rabbi yet. He would become a rabbi. He was a student. This student asked Rabbi, he basically told Rabbi Gamliel on Rabbi Yoshua that Rabbi Yoshua holds that ma'ariv, that the evening prayer is just optional, not required. And this sparked an incident in the study hall in which, when he called out Rabbi Yoshua and essentially demanded a retraction, he caught him on it without getting into every detail. In order to punish Rabbi Yoshua, he made him stand throughout a lecture that was going on, presumably for hours on end, while everybody sat. And it made the rabbis so uncomfortable that they started rebelling in the class. Not just then. They had a meeting and they said, we can't allow Rabbi Gamliel to continue to abuse the honor of Rabbi Yoshua. We're going to have to replace him. So they mentioned a number of different candidates. Rabbi Yoshua was the greatest sage at that time in the academy. Couldn't be the one to replace him because it might look like his kind of fights with Rabbi Gamliel were for the sake of politics, to take his position. So they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to use Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva came from a very humble origin. Some people say he is a descendant of converts. So they didn't want somebody who somehow Gamliel would have a power over. They needed somebody of stature. So they ended up picking Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who we're talking about now. The only issue with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is that he was 18 years old, 17, I think, in the Yerushalmi, and 18 in the Bavli. So what is an 18-year-old guy? He's not a yeshiva bacher anymore. He's in Koilel, so to speak. He has a wife. What does he do? He asks his wife for advice, permission to go be the next Nasi, to be the next rabbinic leader of the Jewish people. And his wife was a very smart young woman, and she said the following thing. She said, don't you understand that there's a good chance that you'll take that position, and after a little while, they're going to demote you? She understood that there was a power struggle going on, and to some degree, they were just using her husband. They didn't really want to just take away the power from Rabbi Gamliel as much as and give it to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. They just wanted to kind of mute the authority, the level of abusiveness that he had, and once they had effectively dealt with that he would Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's usefulness as the Nasi would be over, and they would replace him either with Rabbi Gamliel, as before, or perhaps with one of these other greater sages. She understood he wasn't literally the greatest sage. He was not on the level of Rabbi Yeshua. He was not on the level of Rabbi Akiva. So that was a concern for her. And he said, listen, I'm open to the challenge. I'd rather be the Nasi, even if it's only for a time, than never have had that opportunity to teach. So, okay, fine. But she said, you're still going to have a problem. Even that you want to be the Nasi, even if it's not for a long time, people are not even going to respect you because you're 18 years old. They like to see a rabbi has a certain look. The rabbi looks like he's got some white hair, he's got wisdom and years and so on. You don't have that look, so it's unlikely that they'll take you seriously. In other words, she understood they were using him because of he had great wealth. He was a Cohen, a descendant of Ezra, 10 generations from Ezra, with great yichus all around. So he had a powerful family. So he's kind of like, yeah, your family name will take you very far. It's like the ultimate in yichus privilege, so to speak. Your yichus is going to get you very far, but not far enough, because the yichus gets you through the door only for a time, A, and B, are they really going to take you seriously? They'll say, yeah, we understand why he's here, but that doesn't make him the most qualified. So a miracle happened, and he got, I think, 18 or 19 white furrows of white in his hair, so that he looked distinguished, because white, some gray gives a person distinction. We're about to find that out with all of this. All the hair salons are closed, so we're gonna start seeing lots of gray out there. Gray is going to be the new blonde. It's going to be gray. So we see that's cool, because when you're 18 and you have to teach 40, 50-year-old rabbis, you need to go gray. So that was a miracle. That was considered a great kindness, and he got that. And if we could skip ahead for a moment to the next paragraph, and we'll come back to it to talk about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. The next paragraph says, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, right? Hare ani keben shivim shana v'los chisi shetei omer yitzias Mitzrayim ba'leilos. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I am like 70 years old, but I didn't merit to be able to find like a source for where you know that you have to mention the Exodus in the evening. Ad Shadarsha ben Zoma, until the sage Ben Zoma, who we're going to talk about who he was, amazing figure, great character, until he expounded on a verse, Shenemar, as it's stated in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 3, L'man tiskar ziyem tzeischam eretz Yisrael kol yimei chayecha. In order that you remember the days that you left Egypt, all the days of your life. That's the verse. And here's the expounding, I should say, on the verse. Yimei chayecha, that it says the days of your life, hayamim, that means literally the days, every day. Which, by the way, the rabbis understand in brachot also, like Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, that area and other areas, that there's an obligation to mention the Exodus every day, and we do that in the Shema, in the last paragraph of the Shema. Kol yimei chayecha halelos. All, the additional word all, includes evenings. All the days of your life, the all includes the evenings. The sages say the days of your life mean in this lifetime. All the days of your life include the Messianic times that will continue to talk about the Exodus even when Mashiach is coming. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this statement that we say that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I am like 70 years old. The Gemara says he wasn't 70. The Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, I'll read it here on top. So we said, his wife said you don't look distinguished. So a miracle happened. In the middle of the night, he grew all this white hair, and then Hainu de Kamar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Hari Anika ben Shivim Shana, V'lo ben Shivim Shana. That's why we say in the Mishnah that that's a Mishnah in Brachot and on Daf Yud Beis that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I am like 70 years old, and we just quoted that in the Haggadah, right? And I didn't know how to prove from a text that we recount the Exodus every evening. This is not talking about particularly the evening of Passover. It's talking about every evening, which is a good question. Why is that included in the Haggadah? We'll talk about that in a moment. But here I want to talk about I am like 70 years old. I am like 70 years old, but I'm not actually 70 years old. I'm actually 18 or 17. But I look like I'm 70. Now, here's the question. If I dye my hair white, okay, or a miracle happens, something happens, and my hair goes completely white, and I look like I'm 70, but I'm actually 18. Why? But I'm not 70, so who cares what I look like? A lot of commentaries ask this question, like we don't care that he looks old. He's not old, so what's the big deal that he couldn't find a proof text to back up this claim that you have to, recount the Exodus in the evening as well as during the day? So a lot of people ask that question. There's some interesting answers. I remember when I was in Chabad, the Rebbe gave an interesting answer that it's not just that he was looking old. He actually was a Gilgal of a previous neshama. I think it was maybe Shmuel Hanavi or something like that. So Shmuel, so if you add his 18, and I think it was the 52 years of Shmuel, again, it's a while since I learned that Sikha, but it comes out to 70 years old. The point of the Rebbe is, I thought the Rebbe came out with this, but I think actually later on I saw it was really also one of the great scientists, maybe Newton or something, was it Isaac Newton, that said that we're midgets standing on the shoulders of giants. And the Rebbe said that about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. We learn from there that his greatness was that he was continuing a reincarnation of a pre-existing prophet. So he might have only been 18, but he was relying on the innate wisdom that his soul had. It's a fascinating commentary to bring for most people who have never heard of reincarnation in Judaism, because it's not so much a Talmudic thing. It is very much something in the Zohar and the Ari and other great teachers of Kabbalah. But be that as it may, there's different answers. The question is better than the answer sometimes, but there's definitely great opportunities to look into what that means. But the point is that here's going to be my answer. Here goes. What made him be like 70 years old? Right? Very simple. He needed to be. In other words, his wife was correct. His wife was saying, you're not old enough. They're not going to respect you. Well, guess what? He looked like 70. And I guess when he spoke, he must have spoken not just as an old man, but with wisdom. There's something happened to him that he became wise. So when he says, I'm like 70 years old, what he really means to say is like, listen, for better or worse, God put me in this position. And through this process, I aged. I became an elder, not just a youngster. And yet I still didn't merit to figure this out on my own. And I needed the aid of Ben Zoma to help me. So that's a little bit about rising to an occasion. When you go through a hardship and that challenge brings you up, there's another Hasidic teaching also, which is Nace, which is translated as miracle, has another meaning, which is to raise high, like a banner. Nace is a banner, which means and nisayon, which is like Jeremy says, stress. Nisayon is something that is stress-inducing. It's a challenge that causes us to have stress and anxiety. When the nisayon, when the stress of our situation gets to us in a way in which we rise to the occasion, so then that turns into a nes, malashin, it turns into a banner and a miracle, meaning the miracle of his hair turning white was really not just a physical miracle, but it was him rising to the occasion. So that's what it is to be like 70 years old. It's to go through life experience. Sometimes, I think about my grandmother. May she live many long years. Especially in times like these, you think about somebody who's a little bit older, and you hope that this illness that's out there, God forbid, shouldn't harm them. And my grandmother, when she was probably even younger than Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, she had to take care of groups of children, 20, 30, 40, 50 children, that weren't that much younger than her, and she'd be put in charge of a house of children that were being hidden from the Nazis in Nazi-occupied France. My great-grandfather was in charge, and he would always break up the children into two or more groups. So if, God forbid, one group was caught, the other group or groups would not be caught. And my grandmother was in charge of one of those groups. And could you imagine a 17-year-old, a teenager, having to take care of 40 or 50 kids in middle of Nazi-occupied France? How stressful that must have been, and how challenging that must have been, and how that made her a much older person in just a little bit of time. So the trials that we have, the trials that Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah went through, and we're not, he was the youngest of this group, so he didn't witness the destruction of the temple and the sacking of Jerusalem and the murder of his friends in the way that they did. But he still had his challenges, because he was tapped for a leadership position that really he wasn't really old enough for, but he was the person they chose. And he and his wife challenged him, which, by the way, you learn a couple very important insights to that. I want to talk about this rabbi's wife. It doesn't say her name, but she was a great woman. She understood exactly, in a few words, a few pointed questions, what Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was going to be up against when he took this job. And it turned out that she was right. We'll see as that story continues, that he didn't, it wasn't so perfect for him, but it was still worth it. And we'll talk about what did happen to him. But that's an important lesson when you have a man who's being given a position of power. You got to ask your wife permission. And if you can't convince your wife, you're not going to be able to really convince other people. And it means one of two things. It means either your wife is right and she has a point, and she's the only one willing to tell you the truth, or if she really isn't right and you know it, it just means that your value systems are different enough that your wife doesn't want you to be doing something that you want to be doing. I'm not saying you end a relationship because of that, but just know that that's a second type of challenge. The first type of challenge you can meet because it means you're partners and somebody's being honest with you and sharing what's real, for not just for them, but for you as well. And that's an amazing, that little tiny bit of that story is worth the price of admission, that this rabbi consults with his wife, and his wife is a wise woman and gives him a critique of what may happen. And are you going to be ready for what will happen if you are demoted eventually? And he says he's willing, and she knew what she was talking about. In fact, the story continues. I'm gonna use this story as like a really great springboard to really open up who these rabbis are, because I mentioned the fall of Jerusalem, and we'll talk about Rabbi Akiva and his love life with Rachel, and a second marriage that he had later in life with which is more shrouded in mystery, of a Roman noblewoman. I guess that was after Rachel must have passed away, and some of the other sages. One of them who engaged himself to the daughter of Rabbi Akiva, but never consummated the marriage. I believe that was Ben Azai, who never got married because Shenafshi Chashka B'Torah, he said about himself, his soul desires Torah. He wasn't that interested in women, but he promoted other people getting married. So that's about, the women, a little bit about the women in these men's lives. Then what happens in this story is Rabbi Gamliel had a shita, had this viewpoint that you could only admit into the study hall students whose tocho were kibara, which means their inside was like their outside. A lot of times you meet people, they're sweet, they're nice, till you get to really know them. And once you get to know them, they're selfish. They're not necessarily bad people, but they're not like holy people or good people. They're just moderately self-interested people. So Rabbi Gamliel didn't want students like that. So you had to prove a certain test. You had to, it's like a lot of times I get a call from somebody who wants to know about a certain guy, a certain girl that I know is a congregant. What do I say? Do I know them that I could say that they have no real issues for shidduch? And most of the time I have to say, well, I know them, fairly well. They've been a member of the Shul for 5 or 10 or 15 years, and I see them X amount of times, and they're always friendly, or v'chulu v'chulu. However, you're asking me, how well do I know them? Do I know what the real issue? Do I know if this person has any addictions? Do I know if this person has anger issues? Not on the surface. Not that sometimes I know that stuff. Other times I have no idea about that type of stuff. So the point being is that for me to really say I know somebody inside and out, I got to know them very well. So because for a student to get to be allowed into the academy, their inside had to be like the outside, just like on the outside you're good, on the inside you're also good. That kept most students from getting in. When they deposed Rabbi Gamliel, they replaced him with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah instantly changed the policy and said anybody could come in. It doesn't mean literally anyone. The commentators later explained that a student that on the outside looked acceptable wasn't examined and waited for months or years to determine if his inside was like the outside. That's a very difficult test to pass. And the academy swelled. Hundreds of benches were added that day, so presumably thousands of students were added. But not only was there tremendous excitement in terms of the sheer volume of acceptance of students, but something even more exciting than that happened. Freedom of speech. What happened really is everyone gave forth their traditions. There was no fear of Rabbi Gamliel not liking what somebody was saying. So not only was the new Nasi, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, lavish in who he allowed in, but he was also accepting of what a person said. They didn't have to conform to his particular view the way it often had to in the days of his predecessor, Rabbi Gamliel. And because of that, Masechtas Idias, it's in Zikin, and a nice chunk of Sota, the second half of Mishnayos Sota, and Yuma and other places were bo bayom, so to speak, were the tradition from that day, which either literally means on that day or that time period, according to some other commentators. So I looked up some of these Mishnayos to better understand what was happening. And basically what was happening is tremendous chidushim, tremendous novel understandings that were uprooting prior understandings of earlier sages. And the arbitrator of most of these teachings, especially when they were massive, was Rabbi Yehoshua. So essentially what was happening is, even though Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the Nasi, it was clear that the head scholar was in fact Rabbi Yehoshua. The equivalent would be on the Supreme Court, not the Supreme Court today, but the Supreme Court of Sandra Day O'Connor. Now I say Sandra Day O'Connor. She was not. She was never the Chief Justice. Now it's Roberts. Before it was. My memory is too packed with non-Supreme Court material to remember this off the top of my head. But it was, like William, whatever his name is. I'm forgetting his name. He has a real nice name. The former Supreme Court Justice, Yaakov Arnold, please write what his name is, the former Supreme Court Justice before the current one. So why was it Sandra Day O'Connor's court? Because she was the swing vote. So, thank you, Gabe Gershowitz. Yeah, Chief Justice William Rehnquist. That was who I'm talking about. So Gamliel, I'm sorry, thank you, Jeremy, as well. It's good to see people are knowledgeable and also are listening, so I appreciate it. So I'm sorry, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the equivalent of the Chief Justice, but he wasn't the swing vote. He wasn't the decisive voice. The decisive voice on that time period was Rabbi Yehoshua. So the very same Rabbi Yehoshua who was stifled by Rabbi Gamliel became the most important figure in that period. Now, when Rabbi Gamliel didn't leave the house of study. Rabbi Gamliel was very smart in the sense that he didn't want to be like a sore loser, like he'll retreat to the privacy of his home and just wait and see if anything changes. No, on the contrary, he was part of the debate. And one of the big discussions in the Talmud on page 28 of Brachot is that a certain individual, I think his name is Yankala or something, and he was a convert from Ammon. Let's see the story exactly. Yehuda, not Yankel. Yehuda. Yehuda was a convert from the country of Ammon, and we know the Torah says, Lo Yova Ammoni B'Kal Hashem. There's certain restrictions of Ammon, Moab, and Mitzri. They can only become Jewish after multiple generations. You can't just convert and be like a regular Jew if you're from that. Thank you, Rabbi Rice. Rightfully pointed out that it was Yehuda. Correct. Thank you. So not only did we have constitutional scholars of the Supreme Court, we also have rabbinic scholars in watching here. Anyway, so what does this guy say? Am I allowed to come into the community? So Rabbi Yehoshua starts saying, yes, you can, because Sancheiriv already came, and the country of origins are no longer relevant because he already mixed and mashed up. The idea of boundaries of nationalities are no longer existent. And Rabbi Gamliel challenged this, and Rabbi Yehoshua refuted his challenge. To me, this is actually a fascinating idea because, in a way, if you think about it, this is the end of Judaism and every nation, just as nationhood, as Israel, like Israel, the nation of Israel, Am Yisrael, being replaced with the idea of Israel. There's no longer the people. There's no longer any people. In other words, the tribalism of a particular region or nation is being replaced by ideas. Now, again, a lot of people don't find the word for religion until the time of Maimonides. Maimonides might be the one who created Judaism as a religion as opposed to a way of life or a people. But in a sense, that's not really true. To some degree, it was Rabbi Yehoshua, and to more so Rabbi Akiva. It was this generation who was taking ideas and making them of equal importance as a bloodline. In fact, the idea that Rabbi Akiva is the greatest sage of Israel and yet descends from humble origins, even origins of converts, shows you that ultimately it's not about your yichus, but it's about your Torah knowledge. And that's why we say even a mamzer Talmud Chacham comes before a Am Haaretz that's a Kohen Gadol. That's a meaning it's not ultimately about your yichus, but there's still yichus is still a powerful factor. So I don't want to belittle the yichus, and I'm going to get back to that, because when Rabbi Gamliel saw what was happening, he understood that he had to reconcile. He saw that Rabbi Yeshua was getting his way. So once he saw that, he accepted it. He asked Rabbi Yeshua for forgiveness. Rabbi Yeshua at first didn't want to forgive him because, it's like when you really hurt somebody. What do you just say? I'm sorry, and is it all over? Can you really trust a person who really hurt you multiple times? And Rabbi Yeshua wasn't sure that he could forgive him. But then Rabbi Gamliel said, "Don't forgive me for myself. Forgive me for my family." Meaning, I'm a descendant of Hillel and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Gamliel and so on. Rabbi Shimon and Hillel. They're my Zaydis. And he said, for them, I'm going to forgive you. And then there's a whole story of how he got back into the academy. It was they sent somebody to say certain things that have to do with the fact that Elazar ben Azariah was a Kohen, but at the end of the day, this is the job. The Nasi should come from Hillel, which from the house of King David. In other words, we should retain, even though I said we're transitioning to some degree away from nationhood to religion, we're not really totally transitioning. That would be a false statement to just say that and that was it. That's right. You saw Rabbi Yisrael Rice. Correct. He forgave him because of his yichus, which means that Rabbi Yeshua understood that you do want to have somebody of authority that has the dynastic lineage. So when we look at like rabbis that have dynasties and people say, where is that from? We don't have a Jewish origin. No, that's not true at all. It goes back to the idea of Malchus Beis David and that idea of a continuity even after the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem and ultimately the destruction of our connection to living on the land. We still have a connection to certain dynasties, most notably this dynasty that descends from Hillel that ultimately descended from King David. So it is in this combination. But why all of this excitement on that day? So one of the things I think is because there's a concept that says that when one Beis Din comes and they see decrees of an earlier Beis Din, they cannot uproot those earlier decrees unless they're greater in wisdom and in numbers. So Rashi brings down the reason why they were so successful that day is because so many, the amount of students were mechaded in shmaitza, which means that they sharpened their rhetoric, their kind of rabbinic argumentation, because there were so many voices to be heard. So the way I understand that is certainly true, but it's also because they had the ability to talk, because they no longer had to fear Gamliel. And in addition to that, it was the sheer numbers. There's a concept of rov kamas machriyas ha'echos, which means when you have a lot of knowledge, that constitutes to some degree depth of knowledge, because a broad knowledge does affect the depth of the understanding of something. So that might be one way of understanding it, but not so much in that narrow vein of Rav Kamas Machriyas Ha'echos of how that affects understanding, but more in terms of rabbinic right to feel that we can overrule earlier generations, which they certainly felt that way that day, because they had Kibarabim Hayu Imadi, they had the majority with them, so to speak. Rabbi Gamliel, when he came back, there was a compromise. The rabbis didn't want to demote Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but they didn't believe rightfully that you have two equal manhigim, two equal leaders. So what they did is they said Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah will teach every third or fourth week. They'll alternate. That Rabbi Gamliel will be the main nasi, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah will be like the Av Basin. He'll also be the co-leader, but he won't be the equal co-leader. So that's amazing how they were able to kind of preserve. They both were able to preserve the honor of Rabbi Yehoshua and to reinstate Rabbi Gamliel, and not to totally knock down Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So that's one of the most successful power moves in rabbinic Judaism, in which, at the end of the day, they achieve their goal, and Rabbi Gamliel learned an important lesson not to disrespect his power, and to cede authority to Rabbi Yeshua to some degree, but also that ultimately that nobody wanted to harm him if he would just behave more appropriately, and he learned that lesson. So for me, this is something that we're adjusting. That life is a process of learning, and a lot of our challenges are not with outside authorities that we feel threatened by, or with illness. They're from within. They're from within power struggles and different hashkafas within our own little group or big group, and in that sense, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Gamliel, they were all part of this struggle and all part of this process, and it all went into making who the Seder is really all about. So when we read this Maisa, when we get back to this, so to speak, this story of Maisa, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. This is the people. Rabbi Eliezer is that sage that went through the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Yeshua as well. Rabbi Yeshua is the one who's now being embarrassed and insulted. And then Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the new Nasi, and Rabbi Akiva was an arbitrator there as well. And Rabbi Tarfon we're going to talk about in a little bit. So these are the people who are meeting in Bnei Brak. Notice again, Rabbi Gamliel is not there, and they're talking about Yitzias Mitzrayim Kol Osa Alayla. Presumably, Rabbi Gamliel has his own thing going. He doesn't just join the others. He's too chashiv in a way. But that's why I guess he was left out. It's not necessarily politics as much as he's got his own thing. I see Rabbi Yisrael Rice comments, how astounding is it that Rabbi Gamliel, after he was deposed from a position held for generations, he jumped right into the yeshiva debating Rabbi Yeshua with deference. This is mind-boggling to me. Yes, it truly is. Like I said, he stayed on that day. And I don't know, I wouldn't do that. I would leave if, I wouldn't be like, God forbid you're in a position and you lose the position. You just stay on listening to your replacement and arguing respectfully, because obviously that if you're disrespectful, they'll throw you right out. Like, they didn't leave you in there to try to take your position back in front of everyone. So yeah, that is pretty amazing. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time, because I've got all night, but you guys don't. So let me wrap this up. Okay, I could go on all night because I have a lot of material here, but I'll share a couple more points, but I want to share with you something even more than just details of their life, something very important. By the way, it's you see them again when you want to see where Gamliel is, where Rabbi Gamliel is. We say Rabbi Yossi Haglili. That's another one. He's another of that period, very important, who argues with Rabbi Eliezer, who we already mentioned, and Rabbi Akiva, and then Rabbi Gamliel, the famous Rabbi Gamliel that we just talked about that hasn't been mentioned yet. He says, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach liyatzei chavasa ve'elohen. Whoever doesn't mention these three things on Pesach didn't fulfill their obligation, and these are they. Pesach, the Pesach offering, matzah, the matzah umar, and the mar, and then the Haggadah goes on to explain each one of those things. So it's dominated by the teachings of these rabbis and their period. It doesn't mention Moses because these rabbis have as much to do with the current Haggadah as Moshe did, in some sense, because they were not its literal author, but its figurative authors. They're given honorary credit, so to speak, as if they are the authors of the Haggadah, because this is the point I wanted to make. Because they had a dark night. Because they didn't have what they were used to having. They didn't say, we don't have what we had last year, so we have to give up and not do it. On the contrary, out of that darkness came light. Out of that lack came the Seder night. So for me, this year, I want to be at their Seder. I don't literally want their hardship, but I want to learn from their inspired stories. I want to sit with the people and I want to think about their lives and the lives of the women in their lives, because they had amazing women. Talk about women. Rabbi Akiva was married to a woman who gave up everything. She came from a very wealthy family. Carlebach was her father. And because he was an unlearned shepherd, he cut her out of supporting her in his will. And there's famous stories. This is nothing new. You can look it up in the Talmud or in Wikipedia and so on. But after 12 years, he studied with Rabbi Shabbat Hagadol, right, in Lud. And after 12 years, he came back to see her, and before he entered the door, he heard her talking to a neighbor, and the neighbor was putting her down for a dedication for a husband a deadbeat husband, so to speak, wasn't around to help her and only cost her so much. And she said, if you'd want to study another 12 years, I'd gladly have him do that. And when he heard that, he didn't even come into the door. He just left and went to study for another 12 years. That was the permission he needed. And then 12 years later, he came back with 24,000 students. And there's a whole story in how eventually they didn't want to even let his wife go through to see him, because who's this woman, doesn't look very, significant. And he said, everything I learned was because of her. And anyway, the story has a happy ending at that point, but it doesn't have a happy ending for Rabbi Akiva, because he dies through the hands of the Roman executioner, but not before saying that his whole life he was waiting to be able to sanctify the name of God, and now he is able. And he died while saying, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. As he said, God is one. His soul left his body. So, and he participated or was a fan of Bar Kokhba and the rebellion against Rome that may or may not have led to his death. We don't know all the details. It says his death was because of teaching Torah when it was forbidden from the Romans. But Rabbi Tarfon was a Kohen who actually, when there was a famine, the Medrash says that he had a real wife, but he wanted to make sure that the women who were starving could collect food. So there's certain priestly tithes that the Ashes Cohen, the wife of the Cohen, could collect. So he married 800 women. I don't think he consummated those marriages. It was just a loophole to allow them to collect the priestly gifts that they could survive during the years of famine. Anyway, these were amazing men with amazing women. The women weren't allowed, for the most part, to be in the house of learning as the men were. But despite that, their dedication and their wisdom and their love really made that generation happen. So we wouldn't be here without not just Rabbi Akiva and his co-rabbis. We wouldn't be here if not for Rabbi Akiva's wife, Rachel, and the wives of these other rabbis. So I just draw so much inspiration from that time period, and think we have, whether it's that time period or the actual time period of Yetziat Mitzrayim, or a time period in the Holocaust, or modern day founding of Israel. There are heroes that walk amongst us, or that live, that could live within us, and we should draw deeply from and drink deeply from their well and be inspired by them. I'm certainly planning on being inspired and spending my Seder night with all of these great sages in the past, and God willing, sages in the future. So this will be a Seder to remember. Thank you.